You're watching CapitalCosm. My name is Danny. It is October 23rd, 2025, and I am super stoked today to have a first-time chat with Simon Dixon. Simon, I've been watching your channel on YouTube for quite a while, and I've been a follower of your X accounts for even longer, so I'm super excited to get to pick your brain. You've got a very outside-of-the-box thesis when it comes to the macro finance control grid that's being laid out, and as well as some of the stuff that's going on geopolitically and how that connects to the financial macro thesis too. So really looking forward to digging into your thesis there. For people who may not know, you are a Bitcoin OG investor all the way back in 2011. I mean, I don't even remember what Bitcoin was at that time. Maybe in the hundreds of dollars, maybe even less.
$3.
$3. Wow. So definitely a visionary on that front. But you're also an investor in general, but in a geopolitical and financial analyst and founder of Bank to the Future. So welcome to the show.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I've 25 years in this journey, really. I've done nothing but obsessed over the topic of money, whether it be working in the investment banking field and then leaving in 2006 before the financial crisis, and then spending time on monetary reform in the gold community and also banking reform and various other things. And then, yeah, that drove me to Bitcoin in 2011. So invested in many companies that made the sector, from Coinbase to Kraken and everything in between. And really my central thesis, where I do things slightly differently, is I do what the FBI and CIA do. I follow the money. And what I often find is that everything you see in the media is funded by a certain agenda. And so by understanding that headlines are not the truth, they're simply what a certain agenda wants you to know. And then when you follow their money, you realize that politicians are nothing more than paid prostitutes of a certain agenda. And so therefore, you find out who funds which politicians and who's funding which media. And then I'm able to follow the money and come up with an often different analysis to what most people are looking at. And I found that has helped me get ahead of things that most people that may not necessarily understand power dynamics. And it came from working as, one of these, what I call, in investment banking, and understanding how deals are structured at both the sovereign level, the corporate level, and what these financial markets are for. So hopefully that will bring a slightly different angle to kind of see things that many people may not be seeing at the moment. And we are in one of the most radical shifts, I think, certainly of my lifetime. And I think the next 5 years will be 200 years of change, and the world will be unrecognizable to what it is today in 5 years from now. And people need to prepare for that.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you what's most pertinent on your radar screen at the moment, but since you brought up your thesis, if you don't mind, just kind of giving us a general outlook on the map of how you see global macro and geopolitics. What's the central theme of your thesis? And then as we go on the show, we can kind of pick at different aspects of it.
Yeah. So as an investment banker, the process of financialization and securitization, where you essentially turn everything into a financial product, was for a very distinct purpose. It was given in the names of this is capitalism and free markets. But capitalism and free markets require hard money to function and to correct debt cycles. So when you don't have hard money, then this version of capitalism is simply what I call a debt-based Ponzi scheme. And it means that the entire economy is about recycling debt. And so if you look at the post-World War II Bretton Woods order, where essentially gold, was promised to be the backing of the dollar, after all the gold after World War I and World War II, when Wall Street funded Nazi Germany, funded the Bolshevik Revolution to overthrow the Russian Shah and create the Soviet Union, and also created the Federal Reserve, in order to create this version of capitalism that would inevitably lead to a default. All of those were funded by the same forces: fascism, communism, and fake capitalism. And so that set the world order after World War II, because America had this manufacturing base that gave birth to the military industrial complex. And also under the military industrial complex, all of those factions created this concept of the CIA and the deep state. And most people think of the CIA as something that protects national interest, but it was actually a tool for corporate interest and for Wall Street interest. And so in order to perpetuate debt globally, this network was created that has the military industrial complex, the financial industrial complex, and later the technical industrial complex, and even when you can perpetuate debt, consumer debt, corporate debt, and sovereign debt, what I call the consumption industrial complex. And essentially America became a net exporter of debt. And the job was to indebt the world and enslave the world into dollar debt dependency. And you had this essentially a network and a portfolio of different interests that you could get the world addicted to dollar debt. And then eventually in that process, America defaulted on its promise to have the dollar convertible into gold. And then we entered into this fiat currency standard, which is at the end of a cycle right now, which is what the Trump administration is doing, is what I call fiscal dominance. And we can dive into all these different topics and how to protect yourself. But essentially, because I'm into Bitcoin, we have Bitcoin is backed by something called proof of work. And I believe that the dollar is backed by something called proof of weapons. It's the weaponization of technology, financialization, military, and debt-based consumption in order to back the dollar until eventually the dollar is no longer useful to this network, like the pound was once very useful to the network. The Bank of England bankrupted the British government. The Federal Reserve has now got the government into $58 trillion of debt. The Fed is owned by the banks. The banks are the shareholders in the Federal Reserve. And so therefore monetary policy is dictated by the same banks. You just have people like Jerome Powell, which are Ponzi's for the shareholders of the Fed. And even governments, they are owned because their policy is dictated by lobby. And their lobby is for sale to the network. The biggest lobbies are the military lobby, the financial lobby, the big pharma lobby, the technical lobby, even now the crypto lobby, and even geographical ones like the Israeli lobby, which is a function of military. But you can control politicians, Senate, Congress, and bribe judicial through this mafia network of the deep state. And it all is managed via these asset managers. It's like the Dutch Empire had the Dutch East India Company. The British Empire had the British East India Company. And now the American Empire has BlackRock. And BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and all the public companies that sit underneath it. And so by following these monetary flows, for example, you could look at the balance sheet and the contracts of Raytheon, General Dynamic, and various other military companies. And you can see contracts are leaving the Middle East. They're moving to Europe, Asia Pacific, and it's moving towards technology like cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. So that is a leading indicator of where the next war will be, because I believe all wars are manufactured wars. They are for dollar dependency and dollar debt. It used to be the pound. But eventually we've hit this network now where the network is larger than all governments, and the entire collective West, let's call it UK, US, Canada, Australia, Israel, they're all subordinate to this network, and they're kind of like node operators that essentially just inflict what the network wants, and they're managing portfolios. There's no America first agenda. There's no Canada first, UK first, European first. They've just simply taken the collective West and manufactured them to be tools for this network, which asset strips, creates wars, and many of the global warfare is now coming home. So that takes us into what the Ukraine-Russia war really is, what the Israel-Palestine war really is, and what the escalation in the Taiwan, China, and US. These are all proxies of the network. And I think we'll take a pause there. But that gives a grand overview, which brings us right down into macro and how to protect ourselves as investors.
Yeah, and in Venezuela too, right? I mean, it looks like they're about to start something in Venezuela. Is that part of the same project?
Yeah, so I'd argue that the creators of BRICS, which was an idea from Goldman Sachs, who use America as a host country for the largest capital markets, but have no America First agenda. They are resetting the world order. They are managing a portfolio that weakens the dollar, allows its clients to hedge into gold, Bitcoin, and various other neutral assets, and actually supporting capital outflows into BRICS and regional blocks. And so you've got these sovereign regional blocks like BRICS headed by China and Russia. Then you've got the Gulf Cooperation Council that's headed by Saudi Arabia and UAE, Qatar. Then you've got ASEAN, which is headed by Singapore, Taiwan, these various other blocks. And then you've got the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is China's network. What we're seeing is a reset of the world order into multipolar regional blocks. And America can no longer exert influence over there because BlackRock is now denominating financial products in foreign securities. There is not just the petrodollar, there is now the yuan dollar. 30% of the petrodollar is now denominated in the Chinese yuan. And so Saudi Arabia has found itself where it can manage the petrodollar and the yuan dollar, and it can reset the world order, which means what is left for America? Well, America is the host country of this proof of weapons network. And it is able to, all it can do is exert regional control. So we're witnessing what is its regional control. It's Europe and it's Latin America, it's Canada, it's Mexico, it's Greenland. And so it needs those rare earth minerals that back the military might of what we call the West. And it's going regional. And the profits that used to be made from raging forever wars in the Middle East are now coming back to Latin America and Europe because the network needs continual revenue from war. And the strategy is always vassalization, distress a country so that you can acquire through private equity on the cheap, consolidate into the large public companies, and consolidate power into fewer and fewer organizations. And the irony is that we're actually, anyone in the West, if you're buying ETFs, for example, you're actually paying for the network. So you're handing over your shareholder voting power and your board seats to the network, to BlackRock, which now is controlling a large majority shareholder in over 20,000 companies. And they're essentially, through these passive investment vehicles, exerting board control and shareholder control and subordinating all of these different companies to this network. And they're using that money in order to escalate these wars regionally in order to vassalize and control more power. And so the tactics that in the post-World War II Bretton Woods order that were used in the Cold War, in the Middle Eastern War on Terror, they're all coming home. And so they're subordinating Europe and Latin America and Venezuela, which essentially has large interests in Guyana, which is on the border of Venezuela, for Chevron and ExxonMobil. This is all about regional control to make up for lost profits because the dollar can no longer exert influence in the Asia Pacific region, the Middle East, and some of the BRICS corridors.
Interesting. So we saw this shift from east to west to north to south in the early days of the Trump administration, part two, where it seemed like he wanted to end the conflict in Eastern Europe as well as the Middle East to focus more so on making Canada the 51st state, buying Greenland, possibly even consolidating Mexico, now looking to start some sort of regime change in Venezuela. So it does seem like there is this creation of the U.S. retreating away from the Eastern world and more so becoming a hemispheric power, let's say, where its sphere of influence becomes North and South America. My question to you is this a retreat of the proof of weapons network, or can it also be an expansion as well, because you are seeing BRICS emerge as another potential vassal for that network? Because from what I'm hearing, it seems like it's not really sovereigns or national or countries that are calling the shots. The network can move between these boundary lines, these countries, and acquire any host. So is the U.S. retreating into a regional power, a hemispheric power, a sign of retreat of the network? But can it also be a sign of expansion, that they're moving to become more of a global power through controlling China and the BRICS organization as well?
Yeah, so the network is national. It has no allegiance to country. It just simply manages portfolios. Now, it favors the US because it controls the dollar through the shareholders of the Federal Reserve. So if you can create the dollar and you can create the demand for treasuries, then you will use that network for as long as possible. But there comes a point at which the demographics don't add up. And so it starts to hedge bets. So it will squeeze the dollar to asset strip as much as it can. And it will use that for as long as possible, while simultaneously exerting influence through military might where it can and playing games. And I'd say two of those games were the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians and also the Ukrainian and Russian, which was a CIA covert operation that started in 2014 in order to vassalize Ukraine and test and really throw Europe under the bus for the network. And so these were two games, and you test these games, and then if you can gain territory, you use that to negotiate IMF loans, dollar-backed loans. And what we're seeing is that the IMF is becoming less and less powerful, but the Belt and Road Initiative and various other alternative structures and sovereign wealth funds are becoming powerful. So here's how to litmus test a country's ability to resist the network. If you take your country's resources and you make those companies public companies, then therefore whoever buys those public companies has the ability to vassalize that country and control the resources. So if you look at the Middle East, they're kingdoms that took their resources and made them into cash flows for sovereign wealth funds. And so the sovereign wealth fund across the Middle Eastern regions now has approximately $5 trillion. If you look at BlackRock, they're managing about $12 trillion of assets. If you take BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, Fidelity, and let's call the entire financial industrial complex, is managing about $25 trillion of assets. If you take China, China will not allow a corporate empire to grow bigger than the Chinese Communist Party. And so anytime a company becomes more powerful, let's say Tencent or any technology company, they just simply have to get morphed into the Chinese Communist Party. Whereas in America, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and BlackRock exert more power than the American government. And so the difference in the model is that China is genuinely sovereign. It comes with authoritarianism. It comes with a different model, but it's able to exert influence. And that was the reason, by the way, why Putin became public enemy number one. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Putin came into power a bit later, and he arrested all of the investment bankers and the bankers and all of the oligarchs that were essentially taking all of Russia's oil and turning it into a financial product to vassalize itself for the proof of weapons network. He reversed that and he nationalized those resources. And so the proof of weapons network engaged in raging war on Putin because Putin was building sovereign power for Russia. And so therefore Ukraine was utilized as a covert operation. The CIA did a regime change in 2014. They do colored revolutions to import puppet governments. And then they use NATO as a mechanism for testing the water, and Russia pushing back against that. And then it culminated in the Russian invasion. And now the negotiations we have today, which is simply Ukraine's over. Ukraine is not a real war. Ukraine is going to be owned by BlackRock and Russia. Trump is negotiating rare earth mineral deals. The UK and the IMF took all of the wheat cash flows, created financial products, and used the UK economy in order to construct the financial weapons of mass destruction that guaranteed that BlackRock would end up with any of the resources that are left over in Ukraine. And so Ukraine is just simply a sovereign crisis that leads to BlackRock being able to negotiate deals and negotiate with Russia because Russia is genuinely sovereign. It resisted the public companies and the proof of weapons network, and then partnered with China and Iran in order to circumvent sanctions and create a way of transacting, funding their sovereign wealth through the sale of oil. And that is the worst thing you could do to the proof of weapons network. It doesn't like sovereign countries. And so if you look at the Middle East, they've managed to maintain their resources in order to fight against the proof of weapons network and negotiate an exit of the military industrial complex from their region. That leads to a battle, which is the battle we saw that started on October the 7th, in order to reset the chessboard. And the GCC is essentially buying the exit of America from the region. They bought Europe in order to recognize Palestine, and they're negotiating with BlackRock. BlackRock ended up getting an office in Saudi Arabia. They gave a board seat to Saudi Aramco, the oil public company. They managed to get 10% of the company to float on the stock market. That gave them a board seat. And now essentially the sovereign wealth fund of Saudi Arabia and these different countries are co-investing in every deal. So when Trump goes around saying, hey, we've got $17 trillion of deal, that's reverse IMF. That's the Gulf countries buying the assets of America so that they can exert influence and gain access to all of the artificial intelligence and NVIDIA, BlackRock, the Gulf countries, the Kuwaiti Sovereign Wealth Fund is one of the largest foreign shareholders in BlackRock. And this is a movement and a shift of power where the proof of weapons network couldn't control these countries because of their sovereign wealth. So they partnered with them instead. And so if you look at every deal that will happen from here, it is BlackRock vassalizing, using the financial industrial complex and co-investing with the Gulf countries, and selling those assets as they manage this transition. And so if they could, they would. They tried to do it with India. So India was kind of the weakest link in BRICS because it had this rising public market. And so, the proof of weapons network escalated between Pakistan and India. And eventually Trump had to, come in and push India closer to BRICS through the trade war. So the trade war and tariffs are BlackRock's strategy because they control the US government. And so Trump is negotiating for the proof of weapons network. The trade war was already won by China. The escalation of the tariff policy was a way to reset the world order. These games are already decided up front based upon power plays that have already happened. And so I believe that Trump's tariff policy is BlackRock's policy to usher in a multipolar world order. The negotiations is to sell the key assets of America over to the Gulf countries. And the Gulf is buying partnership to say, hey, military, you exit our region. Let's end the forever war model after a century of you killing, raping, destructing, pillaging, taking our assets. We're now wealthy enough. There's not enough, the debt situation in America is, it hasn't got the same wealth. And so therefore, let's change that. And so the financial industrial complex is partnering with the GCC and BRICS. And
for those who don't know, sorry, Simon, for those who don't know, what does GCC stand for?
So the GCC is the Gulf Cooperation Council. So nobody rivals the power of, after the post-World War II Bretton Woods order, the only rival power was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union fell to incompetency. That made America a global hegemon. And because it removed the gold standard, the proof of weapons network was able to buy the collective West and control all the assets, all the politicians, all the resources, all the lobby power, all the financialization and securitization, all the banks, everything. And so now it controls that entire network. And the rest of the world was unable to compete with that. So America, the global hegemon, everyone ended up on dollar debt dependency. The petrodollar propped up the dollar. But what was they got in exchange? Saudi was able to build these dollar reserves. Once it had dollar reserves, it was able to sell its treasuries and decide, do I put it in yuan? Do I invest in China? Do I invest locally? And it used the petrodollar to buy its freedom, to buy its assets, to buy its influence, because the West is available to the highest bidder. If China wants to buy the West, it needs to become a shareholder in BlackRock. If the Gulf wants to own it. And so what the GCC is the world recognized we need to work in blocks to de-dollarize. And so the Gulf Cooperation Council was the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman, and various other oil-producing and Qatar gas-producing countries that started engaging in economic and political blocks to combine their power so that they could negotiate against the proof of weapons network. And that's what BRICS was. They tried to control BRICS. Goldman Sachs tried to control BRICS by creating a one currency across BRICS and repeating what they did in Europe. So the European Union went to a single currency, and ever since then it's been vassalized. And that was a project from the Bank for International Settlements for the proof of weapons network. They tried to do the same with BRICS, but BRICS resisted that and ended up deciding, let's create trade routes, payment systems, technology that doesn't resolve any type of interaction with the dollar. And so they created all these alternative routes. And so now Iran, Saudi Arabia, North Korea, China, they can trade without the dollar. SWIFT sanctions, they don't need SWIFT. They don't need the payment rails. And so the financial weapons of mass destruction, like sanctions, have become less relevant. In fact, all they do now is push people away from America every time and closer to China. And so, the world started to recognize, if we can go into regional blocks, and people think, is this a resistance against the dollar? No, it's the proof of weapons network that recognized the dollar will not be useful to us forever. And so therefore, we need to weaken the dollar and negotiate with the future of the world. Africa, Global South, Asia, and we need to partner with the countries that we can't control and vassalize the countries we can control. And that's what we're witnessing at the moment.
You make a very good point about the leadership between the East and the West. For example, when you look at China, it's very transparent on who runs China. It's the CCP, it's Xi Jinping. When you look at Russia, it's very transparent there too. It's the Kremlin, it's Vladimir Putin. When you look at America, when you look at Europe, it's not necessarily the president. It's all of these shadowy interest groups, and as you put it, the weapons, proof of weapons network, and it's very murky. It's not very transparent. Is a proof of weapons network a group, or is it more of a vehicle that any given group can take hold of? And what I mean by that is that in 2024, when Trump won the presidency again, it seemed like one faction beat another faction in power, in this power struggle we were seeing here in the United States. Now all of a sudden, all of this woke stuff has been rolled back. It seems like a 180 from where we were in 2020, and now you have Trump talking about going after the Open Society Foundation, George Soros's Open Society Foundation, and all of this stuff. So, is the Proof of Weapons Network a group, or is it simply a vehicle that any given group within the United States can take hold of and consolidate power throughout the entire other group, all of the other groups?
Yes, it's a great question. So people always want to default to some cabal. You can go down the conspiracy theory route. You can look at the history of central banking, the Rothschild families, wealthy families. All of that has merits, but it's not reflective of the reality today. The reality today is that the central banking cabal all exited quite some time and then held some of their power because they went public. Goldman Sachs is public. JP Morgan is public. Some of them remain private, like Vanguard is private, but it's owned by its investors. And so what has ended up is not a conspiratorial cabal. It's actually more like a decentralized, national power structure based upon your wealth and power. And so it changes, it's fluid. And the financial industrial complex and the military and technical industrial complex may all be aligned in most times, but sometimes there's power struggles. And so if you look at, for example, the Palestine-Israel situation right now, I see October the 7th as an operation. That operation was agreed to by all the regional powers, and there was a mission. The mission was Netanyahu, who is a lackey for the military-industrial complex, and Israel, which is essentially a colony of the Proof of Weapons Network and the U.S. military, U.S. interest. It started, as a way of destabilizing the region to prevent competition. Then it turned into the forever war model to make sure that there's a constant flow of military profits. And Israel was that outpost. But Trump is more of a transactional guy. So he is more of a representation of the financial industrial complex. Now, the military industrial complex and the financial industrial complex can be on the same page. Because if you look at what's happening in Gaza right now, the mission was Netanyahu ethnically cleanse the Palestinian, maximize the profits for the military industrial complex. And if you can achieve the Greater Israel project, then we will continue down this model. But if you can't ethnically cleanse the Palestinians and you don't achieve that goal, then we're going to move to partnering with the GCC. And Saudi has said for 20 years that they will not normalize with Israel unless Palestine has a state. And so Palestine will now have a state because the military industrial complex was negotiating its exit for the financial industrial complex. And so Trump represented the financial industrial complex, Netanyahu represented the military industrial complex, and the GCC represented regional stability. The GCC was saying, make Palestine free, don't ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, and we'll partner with the financial industrial complex, and you can profit from rebuild. And they used lots of tools. They created a fund with Jared Kushner, who is Trump's son-in-law, and said, we'll put $2 billion in, and Trump, you usher in this change, and you'll make loads of money. We'll give you a Trump Tower in the UAE. We'll give you $2 billion to invest in the rebuild. And you can profit from ushering in this change. It then went to Keir Starmer, Mark Carney, Macron in France, Germany, and Merz in Germany, and said, right, how much deals do we need to do in order to get you to recognize Palestine? And it hedged the US strategy by going down the EU route. And so the Gulf countries essentially invested approximately $3 trillion in Europe deals, construction deals, buying up assets across the whole of Europe. and persuading the European Union to essentially recognize Palestine. And so you ended up with this game right now where now essentially, and I believe Iran's in on the deal as well. So Iran, if you look at it, if you've read a book called Operation Gladio by Paul Williams, it explains something called how all of these terrorist groups are funded by Western interest. So people think it's like a religious battle, but it's actually militia groups which are for rent in order to destabilize regions. And so the deep state, they have control over these groups. And they actually, one of the things that came out during the Doge Elon Musk things is that in 2024, $695 million was funded via USAID to ISIS and Al-Qaeda training camps. So these groups are funded by Western intelligence to destabilize regions so that they can negotiate for their greater powers, which is the Proof of Weapons Network and various other things. And so when you follow the money, you realize how everything's a lie. There is a narrative, which is what is the acceptable narrative to justify this war? And then there is the truth, which is the monetary flows when you realize, all right, they work for this. And so what I was saying is Operation Gladio it outlines by declassified CIA documents during the Cold War how the military-industrial complex in US would fund both sides of wars, which was Wall Street, always been the strategy. And it would create strategic tension. And so Iran and Israel was a strategic tension. Iran originally was a vassal for the British and French Empire because Britain used Iran's oil to create British petroleum. And there was regime changes to install the Shah that became a puppet for the West. And when you look at things like the Iranian Revolution, you realize you can look up, for example, Iran-Contra affair. Essentially, Iran was receiving money from the West, engaged in a war with Saddam Hussein, which was also being funded by the West. And then the money was a weapons trafficking and drug trafficking route back to South America, which was essentially US weapons going through this elaborate money laundering process into South America to vassalize South and Central America. So, and these are all, you can look up, ask ChatGPT or any AI about Iran-Contra affair. These are not controversial things. These are declassified CIA documents that have now come out after the effect. And so they infiltrate the highest level of power, and this is why there's no such thing as an election. Democracy's a lie. The rich rule, which often you don't know who's actually ruling, as you quite rightly pointed out. You distract people with thinking that changing the left and the right is going to change things. Now, it does change some of the domestic agenda, like you might get deregulation. The Trump administration might do, a pro-crypto, pro-Bitcoin policy. It might crack down on women's sports, LGBTQ, or, some of these minor distractions. But the larger agenda is played by not the politicians, it's played by those that control the lobbies. And that agenda never changes. And so it is a uni-party in this. So all that to say is that if you look at these declassified operations, Operation Gladio was about funding militia groups in order to destabilize regions, fund both sides, and you create strategic tension in order to prop up the profits of the military-industrial complex. And then once the military extracts all profits, the private equity sector comes in, acquires all the assets, the IMF gets them into debt dependency, and then you install a dictator or someone you can control in order to exert a Western policy. And the IMF loans come with all of these terms and conditions, which means you must make your oil public, and you must vassalize your resources, not for your people, but for our network. And so if you look at in 1979, the Iranian Revolution, that was because they overthrew the Western puppet leader, the Shah, because it wanted to nationalize its oil and use it for the Iranian people rather than for British Petroleum. And so it is all in the end about trade routes, resources, and financialization and securitization. And all war is engineered in order to play these high-level games. And these high-level games are played almost like a decentralized network. So can China come along and buy shares in BlackRock and control America? Yes, but it needs to negotiate with BlackRock. And BlackRock will say, we'd like access to these ports, those ports. And if you look at it, if you look at one of the first things that happened, Trump was negotiating over the Gulf of Mexico and changing it to Gulf of America. And Panama became a strategic negotiation. But who was the negotiation between? It was the CCP via a Hong Kong shell company that controlled those ports and 26 different trade routes, negotiating with Trump, but Trump was representing BlackRock because BlackRock was looking to exert control of those trade routes. So you've got China negotiating with BlackRock via Trump. And that's how negotiations actually happen. So now, when you look at all these trade deals, you realize this is just for the proof of weapons network. It's not for America. And it is for consolidation of power into this higher structure at the expense of the average American. Now, you can join the network. How do you join the network? You have to own the same assets as them. And this is what you're seeing within America right now. You're seeing what, and we can go deeper into the macro, is called the K-shaped economy. A K-shaped economy, in its essence, means the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And what is it? There are two classes within America. There's those that own assets, and there's those that are in debt and are an asset to those that own assets. So if you own assets, then you're aligned with the proof of weapons network. If you don't own assets, then you're not aligned, and you are an asset of the proof of weapons network. You are there to extract value. If you take on credit cards, you're now paying 30% interest, and that's the proof of weapons network asset. You're creating the dollar for them and paying their interest. So you get poorer and poorer and poorer while their assets grow and grow and grow. So those that own the asset exert the control. And so the K-shaped economy is everything. Debt is being used in order to create this massive consolidation of all the assets and just an inflationary cycle that the average American just can't keep up with at all. And so they go further and further into debt dependency until they either end up as an unproductive asset, and then even the deep state takes advantage of them because all the drugs they get in because through the CIA. There is no war on drugs. These drugs network, human trafficking networks, drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, these were all created by the deep state and the CIA. There is no war on drugs with Venezuela. There is a deal between the Venezuelan factions of power and the CIA. And where do they fund all these operations? So the military industrial complex, they're public companies, Raytheon, General Dynamic. They cannot say, oh, right, we made all this money from Syrian oil by funding ISIS. They have to say, they have to have black op money. They have to have money that exists outside the company balance sheet. And that's what the CIA and the deep state is for. They have a slush fund that they can pay for these operations by creating this elaborate money laundering network. And drug trafficking, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, and sex trafficking is how they fund it. And so that's why they don't stop, because they're actually a part of the system of propping up the debt-based Ponzi scheme and the dollar in order to fund these covert operations. And I recommend reading a book like Covert Regime Change, and you'll see that over 100 covert operations. Ever since World War I, the US has been in a continual state of war. It's why it's in $38 trillion of debt. And if you look at the debt, what is the debt? It's war. The Middle East essentially took on $10 trillion of debt for the American people. That was $10 trillion of revenue for the military and rebuild companies, the military and financial industrial complex. That was, again, K-shaped economy. print the money, leave the inflation to those in debt. That money then gets recycled via these covert wars, and then it goes back into the companies, which pushes up their share price. Now, this is how you subordinate people. So if you, by using these financial weapons of mass destruction, which is why finance sits on top of this network. And it even controls military, it controls deep state, it controls everything underneath it. Because by deciding who gets access to credit, to get access to bonds, and by having control over share price through the derivative market, you can reset power within the proof of weapons network. So let's say, for example, Elon Musk. Elon Musk is known as the second richest man in America. There was an operation to make Larry Ellison richer than Elon Musk. And that was through Oracle and Tesla. So what did Elon Musk was playing the game. So Elon Musk gets Pentagon budget for his company, and he gets vast money from the big, beautiful bill, because he relies on carbon credits, various other things, all products of the financial industrial complex. The Pentagon budget comes through lobby power. So Elon is now dependent because most of his net worth is his share price in Tesla. So he gets paid based upon his share options and the share price performance. So if Elon Musk does not play game, they can impact share price. They can impact his share options. And what do? They make it where he gets strategic assets like X. So how did Elon Musk buy X? Well, he took his Tesla stock, went to JP Morgan and the financial industrial complex and said, give me a loan against my stock. So now that stock, if you crash the price, can make or break Elon, even though he's one of the richest men in the world.
And Larry Ellison put in $2 billion into
Correct.
that fund. And what's interesting is, ever since he bought TikTok, X has implemented the same changes to their algorithm or similar changes to their algorithms that TikTok did after the sale to Larry Ellison.
Exactly. And they hedge each other, right? They buy shares in each other because they're trying to maintain their position of power in the network. And so if Elon is no longer playing game, i.e. he starts, what can he do? Well, he can try and gain power over Trump. Let's talk about the Epstein files. What is that? The Epstein files are controlled by the deep state. They're not going to be released. Why? Because everyone on those files are the banksters. These are the JP Morgans that were doing all the laundering. They settled 285 million to make sure that, but all these documents are publicly disclosed. People are waiting for some list. The victims of Jeffrey Epstein said, here's who the people are. These are public documents. You can reverse engineer and create the list. It's all banksters and financiers and wealthy individuals. And it's a blackmail operation in order to do that. So you can have a game. For example, you can say, right, Elon represents the technical industrial complex. That is a complex in itself. It is subordinate to the financial industrial complex because they're all public companies. And you could play a game. How can we get more power to the technical industrial complex? Well, we could hedge. Larry Ellison, you get TikTok, the US division. We invest in each other. We acquire X. And how are we going to acquire X? Well, we need to get a loan because we've got to borrow against our stock. You're not allowed to, these are not people. Their net worth is dependent upon cooperation with the banks. And who else did they go to? Who else bought X? The Gulf countries. So the Qatar, Abu Dhabi, sovereign wealth funds. So they've got the money and they're buying power and influence. And the Western entrepreneurs are leveraging their assets to borrow from the financial industrial complex. That makes Elon a tool for the financial industrial complex and the proof of weapons network. If he doesn't play game, then they can destroy his net worth and they can chuck him off the network. They can do that through their derivatives and their share price strategies. And that's what Trump is doing. Trump announces, all right, we're escalating the trade war, 158% tariff. You get a 5% correction in share prices. There are certain people within the complex that knew that was going to happen. Why? because BlackRock was negotiating with China and Trump was delivering the message. BlackRock knew that there was going to be a 158% tariff. That's just a tool of getting more negotiation power in resetting the world order. So all of these different, you think the power structure of the world, you think these entrepreneurs and these companies, now they're all subordinate to the financial industrial complex. And that is the ultimate power structure. And so when the original question, and sorry, I jump around, I can't help myself sometimes, but I'll try and get back to the original answer is, what is the network? The network change is based upon wealth. Wealth is contingent upon being a good player in the network. That's why they meet at the World Economic Forum and the Bilderberg meetings and set the agenda, and everyone has their role. And sometimes people deviate in order to gain more power, and sometimes they get it wrong. But BlackRock always gets it right, and finance always gets it right. Why? Because when they get it wrong, they can socialize the losses and privatize the gains and get bailed out. They can create derivatives to hedge every operation. And so they get richer even when they get wrong. And they can partner with other sovereign countries in order to reset the world order if they destroy the dollar. And so they hedge and manage as a portfolio, and wealth changes. I don't think they predicted that the Gulf countries would use the petrodollar in order to accumulate $5 trillion. And so when everyone's in debt in the West, the demographics, people aren't having children anymore. You need to replace them with AI and robotics, but who's still having children? Africa and the global South. So if you need to employ there, you need to partner, and then it's a new power structure, because the Gulf countries have essentially, and China, what do? They built Africa up through the Belt and Road Initiative, and they co-invested with the GCC. So now the regional blocks are aligning in order to gain more power, and the Proof of Weapons Network is saying, all right, we'll make you, the center between BRICS and America, but we want as much as we can get. And that's what the Palestine-Israel war was. It was an operation in order to set the negotiation between that new power structure, and a retreat from the US, from the Middle East, into a regional power. So the answer is, it depends what you say America is. America is a K-shaped economy where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and the dollar will be utilized to extract value, and that creates civil unrest. What do you do with civil unrest? You weaponize it. You usher in Palantir. You create a surveillance state. You usher in the UK digital ID. In fact, you use open border policies in order to manufacture hate, civil unrest, so that you can buy assets for pennies on the dollar and have negotiation power. And in the end, the financial industrial complex, the Gulf countries and BRICS end up owning everything. And you have all of these different people on the power structure that are indispensable assets if they don't play a game in upholding the structure.
Interesting. It sounds like everyone's in on the game, if I'm interpreting this correctly. Are there any legitimate pockets of resistance out there? I know you said Iran and the Gulf countries are acting in synchronicity, but according to a report from their head of intelligence, Iran's head of intelligence, their CIA, I believe this was today, he said that during the 12-day war, there were 50 plus intelligence agencies from across the globe assisting Israel in that war. And that was the reason why they had to, Iran accepted the terms to end, part one of that war moving forward. So with that in mind, I mean, you think that out of those 50 plus intelligence agencies that were complicit in aiding the U.S. and Israel in that war, I mean, wouldn't you expect to have like some of these Gulf states involved, like Qatar and Saudi and UAE and so forth?
Yeah, so the way that I see it is October the 7th was known by all regional powers that needed to know. And so that entered into essentially the destruction of Gaza, which is leading to the rebuild contracts now. Now, if they could ethnically cleanse that game, remember, Egypt has been fully vassalized into the proof of weapons network, but there was a resistance with Egypt. So once you get them into IMF debt dependency, you then extract and make all of their resources public. You get them addicted to dollar debt. And then anytime they try to resist, use currency wars in order to destroy their wealth. That's exactly what happened with Egypt. It's a classic playbook. Same happened with Jordan. Same happened with Lebanon. Same happened with other regional players. Okay, so Egypt and Jordan, in order to gain access to their USAID and so their IMF dependencies, and they get billions of dollars from USAID in order to exert the agenda of the Western power. Now, don't make judgment calls based upon ethics. This is a mafia. You either do it or die, and you have to outmaneuver. So it's not is Trump a moral person? That's not the right question. The right question is he playing the game where he gains power to be able to be sovereign? And the answer is no. No president can, because they're subordinate to the power structure. And so when we talk about Egypt, is it they're traitors? People like to use these emotional words. They're sellouts. They're traitors. No, they are playing with the mafia. And the mafia, you either play their game, outmaneuver them, or die. And that's the game. Okay? So Egypt was vassalized. They lost the game. Jordan was vassalized. They lost the game. Israel was always an outpost for the military-industrial complex in order to recruit an army to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians and weaponize religion in order to have a justification for why it was happening. You use religious narratives in order to justify it. So the media thinks there's a religious war, but they're not following the top of the power structure. So Egypt was meant to pardon their IMF debt for $18 billion in exchange for sending the Palestinians into the Sinai Desert. That was the plan under the Biden administration. And it was the plan under the Trump administration, but it didn't work for either. And so that was what was meant to happen for the military-industrial complex. But the financial industrial complex said, no, we want to partner with the Gulf countries. And the Gulf countries are saying, we need Palestine to be free. Now, what does the military want? The military wants Iran to go to war, Saudi to go to war, the forever war model, because they lose that game. So if you can persuade a country to retaliate and go to war, then you get Iraq, you get Afghanistan, you get people think that Afghanistan was a war that America lost. No, it was extremely profitable for the proof of weapons network. They got access to all the poppy seeds and opium seeds that are needed to fund the Western heroin trades with the CIA. They got $2 trillion printed and sent over to military companies and rebuild contracts. So that is $2 trillion taken from the American people that paid the inflation over to propping up the stock market and making the rich richer and the stock prices richer. That's a successful operation. In their mind, the goal of the war is not to create peace. The goal of the war is to extract as much value as possible, vassalize as much possible, create as much inflation as possible, and launder as much money into the stock market and the executives as possible. That's the goal of war. And so Egypt was meant to take the Palestinians in and then have the Greater Israel Project, aka the forever war model, continuing. But Egypt and Jordan aligned with GCC, and GCC aligned with BRICS. BRICS came along, and China said, Saudi Arabia and Iran, we're going to normalize between you. And so Xi Jinping announced the normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudi Arabia continued its great relationship with the US, but started allowing for its largest customer, China, to buy its oil in yuan. So it created 30% yuan dollar rather than 100% petrodollar. And so Iran then said, we'll keep selling you our oil and we'll use that in order to normalize. Now, what did China say? China said, let's de-dollarize. You had the Russia side. I don't want to go down that string, but these were all these were all operations that were played at the same time. The China side said, let's get rid of America from the Middle East, and then we can regionally control our region, and we can build up the region. And this means that we can have regional, we can retreat America to its box, but get it out of our box. And the only mechanism for doing that is de-dollarization. So how do we do it? We normalize between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, Iran, by the way, Iran wasn't funding Hamas. Qatar was funding Hamas. Iran funding Hamas was like over a decade ago. Qatar took over that operation. Why? Because the US asked Qatar to host Hamas, the political arm, in Qatar, so that they could have an office, so that money could be funded via USAID in order to destabilize the region, so that there was more extreme elements in charge. So these were funded via Qatar. Qatar said, we'll put a US military base and we'll be a US ally. And so there are these multiple games that are happening at the same time. Now, Iran gains leverage by funding resistance against Israel. It funded the Lebanese resistance through Hezbollah. It funded the Yemeni resistance through Houthis. It funded the genuine resistance of Palestine via the Palestinian Liberation Authority, and then that moved over towards Hamas. But the goal is always, the Western goal is to have destabilization, because they never want the Middle East to unify with the vast oil and wealth that they have and compete. The goal of the dollar and the proof of weapons network is to eliminate competition. So Iran, after it was normalized, it gained its leverage. Now, Iran is painted as the boogie monster, the largest funder of terrorism, but they were actually resisting against Western terrorism, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, these different games that are set up in order to destabilize. Iran was the biggest fighter against ISIS, and Trump assassinated Qasem Soleimani. Qasem Soleimani was known as the ISIS slayer. He was responsible for killing more ISIS people than anyone. And so nothing is as it seems. So they create a Western narrative. Oh, this is, the Muslims trying to kill the Jews or kill the Christian. All bullshit. I just came back from Jordan. It's a Muslim country, and all they tell me about is Christian theology. They were protecting Christian locations. There was the location where Jesus Christ, as per Christian theology, not Muslim theology, was baptizing John the Baptist. And that's protected as part of Jordan. It's only in the countries where they need strategic leverage that they create up narratives that radicalizes the West into believing that they're in a religious war. And that's what Israel was always for, to create strategic tension between evangelical Christians, Muslims with the fake war on terror, and Jews to be radicalized in order to join the IDF and fight for the ethnic cleansing mission, which is the profits of the military-industrial complex. So Iran stopped funding those groups. And I believe they bought into China's plan. China and the Gulf plan, which is now called the Trump plan. Trump gets credit because he's the existing power, but Trump is bought by the Gulf countries and the financial industrial complex. So he's just doing what they say, and he's delivering the news to America. So that's why I know this plan's going to hold, because China's bought into it. The financial industrial complex are bought into it. Trump gets rich from it. The Gulf Cooperation Council have said, we want regional stability. And Iran, while publicly saying that they're resisting, has bought into it. So what was the 12-day war? What was October the 7th? 12-day war, I actually created a video live during the whole 12 days. I was on Spaces. It was called the play-by-play war between Iran and Israel. And I went through how everything was coordinated step by step and gave what I believed would happen next. I got some things wrong, but in general, directionally, I don't know how all the games are going to be played, but I knew what the outcome was. It was a theater. A real war is what Iraq looks like. That was a real war. That's the forever war model. Afghanistan, that was a real war. Those are real wars. That 12-day war was a theater. What was the goal of the 12-day theater? It was to progress towards where we are now. Iran and the IRGC, I believe, in my opinion, allowed the assassination of hardliner IRGC members from the very top I can't prove it, but I was able to predict directionally where we're going based upon these forecasts because of the normalization between Iran and Saudi. Now, they could never say that. They can't say we allowed. But remember when the prime minister of Iran dropped down in a helicopter and suddenly died?
Mm-hmm.
Everyone was saying that was Israel. I think that was the IRGC. They were doing an internal regime change with the public narrative that they were still holding on.
And the guy that came after him, Pezeshkian, is like a complete 180. I mean, they call him a lame duck over there. I mean, if everything that Raisi was, who was the leader that crashed in that helicopter, Pezeshkian is a complete opposite.
Yeah, absolutely. So Iran got to say, now here's how I know it was theater from my perspective. There has never, ever been a moment in history where Iran is able to fire ballistic missiles on Israel and America come back with a clown reaction, which was a pretense that it was taking out the military program. The military program isn't going out. I know that interestingly because I was looking at hash power in Bitcoin and there was a movement of nuclear power. And interestingly, that you could time that with the actual, there was all these interesting things that when you connect the dots, you can see. But anyway, there was 3 outcomes to come from that war. Iran was to allow the hardliners that weren't on board with China's plan to be taken out and blame it on Israel. Israel got to say, we took on Iran, and look at us, our superior intelligence took out the IRGC, they're decapitated. Iran allowed for the pager attack to happen on Hezbollah to take out the hardliners, in my opinion. They also allowed for the assassinations of the various Hamas hardliners, in my opinion. And they allowed IRGC members to be taken out. Now, America got to say, everyone was saying this is World War III. We're going to go to World War III. Trump's a traitor. He's going to take us to World War III. Israel rules the world. He's blackmailed by Epstein and that's Mossad and all that stuff. I was saying, when they go in, it will be very controlled and they will leave. Because Trump got the narrative he needed. We took out Iran's nuclear program, which is complete fugazi. Iran's nuclear program is about nuclear energy. And the nuclear energy can be enriched in order to create this strategic tension that justifies the economy that's grown around this military industrial complex and, Iran, Israel type of theater. And by the way, it's not as simple. It's not like they're actors. They genuinely hate each other. But this is how geopolitics works. You have to cooperate with people you hate. And you have to find diplomatic ways of regime changing without risking being overthrown. And these are the way these games are played. Now, so you had 3 narratives. You had Israel was able to say, we took out Iran. Look at our superior intelligence. We're winning. And America's our bitch. Trump got to say, we took out Iran's nuclear program. And we did it in and Iran is defanged. They're weak, never to come back again. And Iran got to say, we blowed up Israel. We took out their resources. We demonstrated our ballistic missile supremacy. And we continued to fund the resistance. All 3 of them got to go back to their media and say, we won. So Iran went back to Press TV. Trump went back to Fox. And Israel went back to Channel 13. And everyone said, yeah, we won. Everyone said they won. Okay? So now you've got a reset. It was only a 12-day war. It ended. Trump got to say, I get the Nobel Peace Prize. I created peace between Iran and Israel, and I took out the nuclear program. That's his reward. He'll get it in 2026. I thought he would get it this year, but instead they did a CIA agent in Venezuela instead that's doing a regime change for USAID. But Trump gets his reward. He gets his... but to me, everything that Iran is doing is implying to me that they have normalized with Saudi Arabia. And the strategic tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia is over because China said, I'll buy your oil, Saudi Arabia. I'll buy your oil, Iran. And we will make a way where sanctions are never can be powered. And Saudi, you just negotiate with Trump, reset the world order to this multipolar world, and buy as many assets as possible. And you will sit in the center of the world between the petrodollar and the petro yuan. And that's your reward. And we can de-dollarize. And that's where we are. So my prediction is, if, and I don't believe there will be, but I could be wrong, if there is another escalation with Iran, is definitely not World War III. It will be similar to the 12-day war and maybe never happen at all. But the narrative needs to continue because the military needs its profits, and Americans always need to be radicalized into the belief that there's a boogie monster that's about to take them out. But I believe my prediction, if I'm wrong, if I'm right, there will be no ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians when everyone said there would be, because Egypt and Jordan didn't allow for it. They resisted against the IMF's demands because they were backed by the GCC, because they were backed by BRICS, and because China normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia. There is a bigger vision, and they use that leverage to negotiate with the financial industrial complex so that the military could piss off and go to Venezuela and Europe and take $1 trillion out of Europe, negotiate new NATO budgets, and destroy Europe and vassalize Europe. That's what we're witnessing.
I mean, you've laid out the groundwork very comprehensively here, Simon. You've answered the what of the question. I guess the then what would be the question pertaining to that is, do we see World War III at all then? Because from what I'm hearing here, if we are to have World War III, it won't likely start in Iran and Israel or the Middle East. But you did have this all hands on deck meeting a few weeks ago at the Department of War, I should say. Used to be the Department of Defense, but the Department of War, where they brought in every single general stationed from all over the world to an event where pretty much Pete Hegseth just called them all gay and fat, for lack of a better term, and told them to prepare for war. What was the point of that meeting? Is it an indication of a coming world war or a war of some kind, whether it be kinetic or otherwise?
Yeah, so my prediction is we avoided World War III. We are nowhere near World War III. We're just in narrative control to justify military profits. So China has no incentive of reunifying with Taiwan. They're building their own semiconductor chips. They got 90% dominance on rare earth minerals. America cannot make a weapon without China, which is how you know this is all fake. Mm-hmm. And even America's nuclear program is dependent upon buying highly enriched uranium from Russia. You know, literally, America is buying uranium from Russia. Europe just announced their 19th or 20th rounds of sanctions, which is a sanction against themselves because they're destroying their economy because they work for the financial industrial complex and the military industrial complex. They're just taking money printing and handing it over to US military contractors. They're destroying their manufacturing base to full dependency upon US. US is now a net exporter of oil and gas. And so suddenly you can't get gas from Russia. You need to get gas from America. And that's a lot more expensive. That takes out your manufacturing base. That takes out and makes you fully subordinate and vassalized to the proof of weapons network. The leaders in Europe are destroying their economies, using their central banks to get new contracts for the US stock market for both military and financial, because they're fully captured into the proof of weapons network. And all they've got to do is try and pretend that they're doing it because Putin's Hitler. That's their narrative. Now, World War III is nowhere near where we are right now. If we were in World War III, there would be a real war with Iran, and there would be a real war with China. China doesn't want it. The proof of weapons network know that that's not how the world works. We don't have military domination anymore. We only control our region. And so we are nowhere near World War III by my estimation, or following the money, in my opinion. But you will always get that narrative. The narrative continues forever because they need the forever war model somewhere. Americans need to always be justified. Why are we now getting a $5 trillion debt ceiling with a $1.3 trillion big, beautiful bill where it's going to Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, and Palantir? America cannot launch a World War III because nobody would win. And everybody knows it. China doesn't want it. Russia doesn't want it. The GCC don't want it. Saudi doesn't want it. So who is in power right now? BlackRock and the financial industrial complex, China, which essentially partner with Russia. Russia's the power as well, because they economically survived this and got their debt to GDP down to like 9%. They got, during this war, they got their debt to GDP down from 22% to 9%. And the world was saying Russia's going to be economically destroyed. China only exports 15% of its economy to America's consumption. And we hear these things about 230% debt to GDP. But China is a state banking system. All of that debt is to itself. They're not a privatized banking system like the dollar and the Federal Reserve. They're PBOC and a network of community banks. 99% of Chinese people own their property. China stopped consuming because they're worried about their savings, not their debt. And so this debt is just a mechanism for actually, resetting a bubble in its own domestic economy, which is a state banking system. But China's a surplus country and a manufacturing base. I mean, they say they've got, I know they've got, I mean, if you look at their different gold reserves, I find it hard to believe that what they're disclosing is their actual gold reserves. Some estimates are like 22,000 tons of gold. So China wins this trade war. They can ride this out for as long as possible, because the goal of Trump was not to win the trade war. It was to reset the world order for the financial industrial complex. And that does not involve World War III. This was a retreat. Everything that's happening right now is to avoid World War III based upon a multipolar world where there would be no winner and no one wins. So I personally believe you can forget that. But there does need to be, there's $1 trillion to be made from escalating with Russia. Russia won't lose. Russia will end up with more Ukraine. Ukraine's over from my perspective. Because Zelensky is a puppet. His job is to extract as much value as possible. Keir Starmer is to give him as much money as possible. Merz is to give him as much money as possible. Macron is to give them as much money as possible. And Carney is a conduit of the Bank of England anyway. Their job is to give as much money as possible, create $850 billion, confiscate $350 billion to prop up the US stock market, to perpetuate the debt-based Ponzi scheme, while the proof of weapons network is hedging the decline of the dollar. And meanwhile, the dollar is getting lower and lower and lower. The DXY is around about 96%, I think, is at its low. It started the Trump administration over $100. And gold is through the roof. People aren't buying gold, they're selling dollars. Now, who's the number one buyer of treasuries right now? Cayman Island. Who's Cayman Island? The proof of weapons network. Is your endowment funds, it's your hedge funds, it's your ETFs. So Americans are being dumped on with the treasuries. Foreigners are selling. Japan is reversing the carry trade by putting up interest rates. That's definitely capital outflows. And in order to have capital outflows, you sell your asset, you get dollars, you sell your dollars. What are you going to buy? You buy Swiss francs and gold. And that's exactly what's happening. This is a controlled demolition of America to a regional power. Now, who is America's biggest enemy? The proof of weapons network know who their biggest enemy is: the people. So they need a surveillance state. They need a police state. They beta tested genocide as a service in through Palantir in Gaza. They beta tested occupation as a service in the West Bank. They beta tested integration with drones in Ukraine. They beta tested the police state and the surveillance state in UK. And they beta tested civil unrest across Europe. And now they're bringing it home. And they know that digital ID, central bank digital currencies, stable coins, everything that was in the Genius Act is the mechanism for controlling civil unrest. They know that the American people and the European people is the enemy. And so while they're manufacturing the destruction of the West, they're making you pay for the surveillance state to control you in case you get out of control. And that's exactly what's happening right now. How do you deconstruct the dollar? You take on the so-called quote unquote deep state. The deep state propped up the dollar. The covert operations propped up the dollar. So if you take down USAID, what are you doing? You're taking down the constructs of covert war that got the IMF to take over all these countries to prop up the dollar and get the world dependent upon the dollar. It's the perfect narrative. Trade war, we're bringing back the manufacturing base. We're going to make America great again. USAID, we're taking on the deep state. NATO, we're going to get you to pay for everything. Why? Because now you get your budgets, you prop up our stock market. In the meantime, what are we doing? We're creating inflation for the everyday American. We're wiping out Main Street and small business because they're having to pay all these tariffs. The large multinational corporation ain't paying it. Apple's got negotiations on both sides, and they can negotiate directly with the Trump administration. The small businesses are paying it, the ones that can't afford the tariff. The export-dependent countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, they're being vassalized into the proof of weapons network. And meanwhile, everyone's saying there's no stable business environment with America anymore. You can't trust them. So India goes west, everyone goes west, and everyone says, China, what's your deal? And they'll say, well, we'll rebuild your economy and we won't regime change you. Let's kill the IMF. And so the IMF percentage of GDP is being replaced by GCC sovereign wealth and Belt and Road Initiative. And yeah, they're going to take advantage of the situation. These are still predatory deals, of course, but it's much better than the IMF model. The IMF model is you pay for your demise and you get your currency destroyed and your people get their wealth taken away to prop up the dollar. So Trump is doing everything for the financial industrial complex and the proof of weapons network, and he's profiting from it. He gets rich. He's got vast wealth. He's doing every deal he's doing. He's got his fund with the Saudi funding that was to buy Trump. He's going to profit from the rebuild. He's launching stable coins, which essentially are taking $2 billion, where the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund is investing in Binance, the largest Bitcoin exchange. Then he issues a stable coin through a company called World Liberty Financial. That stable coin gets that $2 billion, facilitates a flow of the largest exchange to the Abu Dhabi. He just pardoned CZ, the founder of Binance today, and he gets $60 million interest by buying treasuries with those dollars that backs his stable coin. Then he gets his fund that gets to profit from Trump Towers and various other things. And who is the largest borrower that he's borrowing from? ICBC, the largest bank in China. This is what you get to do. And it's this is, again, I don't want to, some people would listen to this and say, you got Trump derangement syndrome. I'll do the exact same analysis with Biden, the exact same analysis with Clinton, the exact same analysis with Obama. This is not left-right. This is not Trump derangement syndrome. This is understanding the real power dynamics of the world and what presidents are for, what Congress is for, because you sold your economy, you sold your politicians, and you listened to Goldman Sachs, and you created a power structure that supersedes any type of sovereign government out there. And that's the reality of the world.
All right, Simon. Wow. Amazing interview. Really, really eye-opening on many fronts. I hope you guys got a lot of value out of it. Simon, my friend, let's go ahead and stick a pin in it for now. But tell us where people can find you. And if you have any closing comments, anything else that you want to mention out there before we sign off? The floor is yours.
Yeah, once you understand the power structure of the world, without truth, you can't really make the right decisions. The only way I know to beat the system is to invest with the system or boycott the system. And so that's why I'd like to leave people with that. So I personally believe that there is a spiritual element to money, and profiting from blood money when you understand the system comes at a massive spiritual cost. And I do believe in a higher being. I do believe that there is a greater power structure, which is God. And so, power changes, but there is a spiritual journey. And so you have two choices. You only beat the system by owning the same assets as the system. And then you don't get caught on the wrong side of the K-shaped economy. The alternative is to boycott the system. And that's why I like Bitcoin and gold. Gold allows you to neutrally step outside of the system. The reason I like Bitcoin, is a higher risk version of it, is because you can take it in self-custody. Most people can't hold gold in self-custody. You can, and if you can, that's a great thing to do. But most people own it via an ETF, and the ETF makes the proof of weapons network more powerful. They even have tax incentives to make sure you do it, because they want you to own it through them, not through yourself. And so with Bitcoin, you can take self-custody. Now, there's a beautiful of Bitcoin. You get to boycott the Federal Reserve. When you take it in self-custody and not through their ETF, you get to boycott BlackRock and the financial industrial complex. If you don't borrow against it, you boycott the engine of the network, which is debt. And if you spend local and start to become conscious with how you spend and allocate your money into local, and it's not perfect. I need to use AI. I can't be effective without using AI on an iPhone. But wherever you can, be conscious of how you're spending your money. Invest local, invest in decentralization, invest in resistance, technological resistance, decentralized artificial intelligence, and various other things. Just be conscious with your money, because community is how you protect yourself. And I personally believe that boycotting the system is something that we can collectively do, because there is one thing. The proof of weapons network cares about profits. And if you drain those profits and impact their share price, they will listen. Not because they're ethical, but because it's more profitable to go in a different direction. And so we, at the end of the day, are the consumers, and they need our money. And our money is what we actually gain control. And your vote is not your politician. Unless you can buy politicians and you're part of a lobby, then you're playing the real game. And so the only way to beat the system is to boycott the system, get wealthy, because it just so happens that gold and Bitcoin are designed where there's a fixed supply, and it has outperformed the proof of weapons network over a longer term time frame. And that's something we can all do. And you can, and so, that's where I kind of leave people with solutions of be conscious with your money, and it is our money that they need. Because if we stop borrowing, their system crumbles. If we don't be part of the money creation process, if we exit the system, then we can regain power, and they will adjust based upon that. And so that's where, kind of a message I'd like to leave people. In terms of where you can contact me, we'll do more. I can talk for a long time. You have to break it down into, we'll take different threads if you want. But I go live every single week on my podcast, Bitcoin Hard Talk, where I do This Week in Bitcoin, This Week in Macro, and This Week in Geopolitics, and spend an hour over everything that happened and how they all connect together and follow the money. I publish it all on my blog, simondixon.com. I'll put even this video so that we can share our audiences on Simon Dixon, my YouTube channel. And I regularly go live on X, where I give hourly commentary on things that are happening. So you can follow me on X, Simon Dixon.
Awesome. Simon, thank you so much for your time, my friend. I greatly enjoyed this. If you enjoyed this podcast, drop us a like and comment. Go, Simon, go in the comment section. If you agreed or disagreed with anything, either way, do let me know. I do, in fact, read all the comments. And I will be replying to a small handful of comments as well. So drop me your thoughts. It's greatly appreciated. And by liking, subscribing, commenting, doing all the YouTube stuff that I tell you to do, you do help us in boosting this video and this channel and the algorithm. So may not seem like much, but a little bit does go a long way. And it's free. Everyone's favorite 4-letter F word. So with all that said, guys, I appreciate your time and I'll catch you later. Bye.